10 funerals that went horribly wrong. It's every funeral professional's worst nightmare, or many of these on the list. I'm Nathan. I spent 13 years in the funeral profession. We're diving right in. Number 10, that's the wrong video. This should probably be saved for last, but you'll get why. Before we begin, be sure to subscribe. Click that bell to be notified when I release content exclusive here on YouTube. I'm a musician too, so be sure to stream my music. But nonetheless, wrong video. Many times, it's very common for families to create memorial videos. 10 years ago, 5 years ago, it was DVDs. Now it is thumb drives. People will go out of their way to gather photos, whether it's 35 grandkids and they're sending them on their iPhones, and the one that sends on their Android. We won't talk about them. And then you have the parents of the grandkids scanning photos or taking pictures of those photos. So you want to designate one person. I tell you all that because navigating the world of the memorial video is quite cumbersome, but it's a great outcome because so many family members want it. Okay. That is painting the picture of the memorial video. It plays at visitation, oftentimes at the funeral. In this instance, it's playing at visitation at this church. A 25-year-old husband lost his wife in a car crash. And so he and his father, would have been the father-in-law to the deceased, spent hours working on a memorial video. Obviously, being a young woman, tons of friends, tons of memories. Very sad situation. They come up with this beautiful tribute. They get it to the funeral director, who is in charge of making sure that it's to play during a specific time of the visitation at this church. They get it placed in the DVD player. Now that's, yes, a DVD player. And then at the specific time, they play the DVD, and it's porn for about 5 minutes. Pornography is playing. Audio's going through the church. People are looking around. The family are super pissed, as they should be. The funeral director is up in arms, has absolutely no idea what's happening. They finally figure it out, and they get it turned off. And at the cemetery, to make matters worse, of course, the minister has to play it off because, "What's that noise?" he says. He had no idea. Nonetheless, they did an investigation, and the funeral directors were not held liable. The church had absolutely no idea how it could have happened. The only thing that they believe could have happened is, you know how DVD players, I don't know if you know that, but DVD players that also would connect to streaming services, now it's just the TVs, for instance, but they believe that a DVD player may have been returned, placed in the box, and it was set with an account, and it just wasn't taken off. Nonetheless, no one was held responsible for that. Although it's very unique because in the funeral profession, grief has this unique place that it's placed, and it doesn't even have to make sense. It could be arbitrary. It could be like, "Oh, I'm mad because the candy wrappers are in the trash a certain way." No, I'm serious. That's how that happens. There's tons of reasons that people get upset, and they're all valid at the moment. And I absolutely believe that you should meet people where they are and take nothing personal in general, but specifically when there's a delicate moment such as a death. Now you know why I should have saved that one for last, but I got you here, right? I did. Next on the list, where's my body? Another sad situation. A young lady died of cystic fibrosis. If you are not familiar with that, it is a very terrible disease. She was deteriorating very quickly, and her husband, of course, wants to honor his lovely bride who succumbed to such a terrible disease. Visitation is happening, and after the visitation, they chose for cremation. Now, just so that you know, it is not required for embalming to take place. If you follow me on TikTok at Nathan Morris Music, I'll link it in the description below. Lots of people ask that over and over and over again. In Kentucky, where I'm from, the law states if a casket to be opened with public visitation outside of immediate family, embalming is required. Outside of that, you can have a closed casket visitation. You get the point. This is a family that chose visitation to the public followed by a cremation. Yes, you can do that too. What is that? Well, you have visitation. The public comes. Yes, they can be embalmed. Afterwards, the family will leave, and the loved one will either be A, taken out of a casket that is rented, a rental casket that is specifically designed to open at the foot end to slide a specific type of insert in the casket, which houses the loved one. That container will then go with the loved one into the crematory, because by law, you have to have a minimum container, which a cardboard container is the minimum requirement. Or, which someone argued with me on Facebook about this, which you can follow me there too, Nathan Morris Music. All of these are Nathan Morris. Or the loved ones stay housed in a casket that is purchased by the family, like my cousin. He stayed in a wood casket that the family selected for him. It was beautiful. And then I personally placed him in the crematory in this casket, the wood casket cremated with him. Okay, visitation's complete. The family leave. The young lady is to be cremated. The next morning they come in. No young lady, no cremation. Yes, you heard that correct. No young lady, no cremation. There was no forced entry at the funeral home. Of course, the suspect, the prime suspect, is immediately going to be the husband. They had people reportedly saying, oh, he was acting very obsessive during the visitation because he stayed no less than 10 feet away. Are you serious? That's how this works. Whenever people come to pay their respects, and if it is your immediate loved one, you are standing there to receive them. You don't leave the loved one's side. In this instance, you have a 25-year-old sweet young lady who died. Of course the husband's not going to leave. I would think. I would be kind of concerned if they weren't around. Nonetheless, they investigated him. Nothing. The funeral home had a third-party cremation service performing cremations. Now, that could be a number of different things. It's not uncommon. Smaller funeral homes that don't own a crematory will use another crematory. It's okay. The funeral home just has to say cremation services, not crematory, because crematory states that you own the crematory and actually facilitate and perform the cremations. This third party had actually come under fire the year before for cremating the incorrect body, which I don't know why they would continue to use them. Nonetheless, it's unfortunate that it happens more than you would think. In this instance, this cremation service had not even received or completed the cremation. To this day, they haven't a clue where the loved one's body is, cremated remains or otherwise. Could you imagine? No, I could not either. It's very sad and scary to think about that. That is why I say all the time, it's very important to know before you go. Educated people make educated decisions. The profession as a whole is the most beautiful traditional funeral home. The profession as a whole is the most beautiful traditional experience and has gone largely unchanged because it doesn't have to. And the small things that do change, the technology, a lot of the senior professionals, they don't want, like this. They hate it because they are of the old mindset of there's the delicacy aspect. People don't want to know. Well, we do want to know because people were looking on YouTube for how-to videos the entire pandemic. We want to know why, how, what things are. And so that's why I want to tell you about all of these experiences so that you don't have them. Call your local funeral home, whether there's one or three, call all of them and get a tour, ask for a general price list, meet the staff, see who you vibe and jive with. It's very important. Yes, it's very important. And I encourage you to find funeral homes that are members of the National Funeral Director Association. It says national, it's international, because they have requirements. On top of that, there are other organizations within the profession, but National Funeral Director Association is very important. Of course, a license to operate in the state in which you live, but yes, definitely do your research. Next on the list is Somewhere Over the Rainbow. Yes, Judy Garland. She played Dorothy in Wizard of Oz. Now, she died of a drug overdose in 1969, and this is a horrible thing that happened at a funeral because upon her death, it is alleged. This is not fact per se, but there are a lot of facts that point to this being one. If you follow that, yeah, the webs we weave. Her death, and it was alleged that she was a homosexual, and this is before the mass acceptance of, so the LGBTQ community as a whole were so fed up in New York City. And that particular day of her death, and that is what they say sparked these riots that occurred because they had been fed up, the community of gay and lesbians, and they wanted to feel heard. And her funeral Judy Garland's death and funeral sparked this uprising of a community. And again, this is not validated by just definitive facts, but all the facts do point to this being highly suspected, not expected, suspected. I wanted to touch on that just because I believe in this is all about meeting you where you are. I don't care if you have much or little. I don't care what and who you celebrate or who you worship or what you think. I just hope that you know that you are worthy to be celebrated, to be loved, and you are accepted here, and I meet you here. That is the whole purpose of this, is because I believe we're all worthy to be celebrated, whether simplistic or elaborate. However, I just genuinely believe that. And so the community that I create, whether it's this space or wherever you find me, the podcast, You'll Die Trying, that's what the goal is. And that's why I touched this topic, because sometimes it does take grief to create a movement. Because through suffering, there is victory. Through suffering, we can find goodness. And without suffering, there's not this ability to have compassion for, to have the ability to genuinely relate to. And when you have suffering, you're able to see through perspective, with perspective. Perception, they say, is reality. No, perspective is genuinely being able to acknowledge something, someone, and to hear them, and it not be surface perspective. I'm off my high horse. Let's go to the next one. Next on the list is in South Africa. Christopher, I won't even pronounce his last name, Yahoo, whatever. I say that because we won't ever, you'll get the reason why. So his wife dies. He stands up and gives the most beautiful eulogy. Well, he also ends up on trial. For what, you say? You ask? Yes, for murder. And guess what? Guess what? He's found guilty. Yeah, who'd have thought? The spouse is always the suspect first. If you follow me here on this channel here, which be sure to subscribe and click the bell. We're always talking about crime podcasts, crime documentaries, paranormal stuff that doesn't necessarily have an explanation, but it never fails. The crime podcasts, the crime stories always have the suspect being the spouse, which is important. Yeah, I agree. But nonetheless, he's convicted of murdering his wife. Not only that, it comes out that the guy, the idiot, plagiarized the eulogy. This beautiful eulogy, not just some of the eulogy, not just bits and pieces of, no, word for word, verbatim, the eulogy of his beloved wife's funeral. That he took her life, and then he took the eulogy from someone else and made it his own. Which, the days of AI now, that was 2015, but the days of AI, you could take something, you could place it in AI, ask AI to rewrite it, and then continuously reformat it until it becomes yours and make it your own. There's no reason that you should plagiarize anything, stealing it and saying that, hey, this verbatim is my work. Obviously, you want to credit it. I mean, credit is important. Now, if he had quoted, I don't know what the exact rules are, but I think that if he weren't a piece of trash, I say that with love, but he took someone's life. That's like the most terrible thing you could do. Then you could think of something genuine to say about someone that you love. I love speaking to people that I love. I was asked once to speak at someone's funeral that died far too young. I was very privileged to do so. It's really important for me to tell people that they are important. That's something that I really thrive on. It's important for people to know that life is not about us individually and selfishly. It's about the other. And so showing up for other people actually is fulfilling for self. And that's why I like to make sure that people I'm around, and in the instance of speaking to this loved one, let this family know how much this individual means to me and so many who are obviously gathered to celebrate them. This one is probably the one you visualize as a funeral professional over and over and over again. So the funeral professionals, there are a few things that you daydream about, but then there are also things that you actually lose sleep over. You lose sleep over, did I call the minister? Did I send the obituary tribute to the appropriate people, to the newspaper? Is it up on the website? Because now you have your remembrance pages that live forever online, and people can post the their condolences. And then on the anniversaries, it's really nice to do that. So those are the things that you're like, oh my gosh, did I do that? Did I write the honorarium check? Or did I wash the cars? Did I fill the car up with gas? Like the things for the next day. Did I order the flowers? The thing that you daydream about are things such as what I'm about to tell you. Oh, another one is a loved one who is embalmed and having visitation. The thought of them purging, to not get too graphic, purging is whenever there's fluid that comes out of an orifice on the head, face of that. The thought of that, because the goal of a public visitation is for the family to have as comfortable of an experience as possible, because it might have been an illness that took a loved one, and maybe that means that they were losing large amounts of weight. Maybe the illness put fluid on their body and they became swollen. Maybe it was a tragedy that took them. And embalming that loved one and using restorative art and doing all the things that you're trained to do in hopes that when they have a first private view, the family can see them in a more memorable state, that they remembered them before the illness, before the disease and or tragedy took them. Okay? You don't want purge. This is the daydream that you actually lose sleep over, and it's called the fallout. It's not really called that, but that's what this is. So in 2021, in Los Angeles, California, the Morales family are having a visitation for their patriarch, the father of the family. He was a very well-known man. And of course, as his casket is being carried, the bottom falls out, as does the loved one. You've seen it in like Johnny Knoxville on Jackass. You've seen it comedies and movies where they jokingly have people tipping out of a casket. No, the casket bottom fell out. Now, how does this happen? Well, it probably was, I would put all of my money on it, that it was a wood casket. How did that happen? Well, wood casket, you have possible bodily fluid. That's natural. Whenever you die, decomposition starts. Yes, embalming does slow the process. However, I don't know if this loved one was embalmed. Even if they were embalmed, you still can have fluid leaking. And wood can absorb fluid. And then oftentimes some caskets have their pressed wood. So to save money on materials, to have a pretty casket option, they'll use more of a veneer wood. So that is just grounds for fluid. That's not good necessarily either. Also, it was said and alleged that the weight of the loved one had something to do with it. I'll obviously add just a little note here. Funeral professionals, they lose a lot of sleep over caring for loved ones. And on these videos that I post and people say, oh, my loved one didn't look like them, those are the comments that really are hard for funeral professionals to hear, because they try so hard, they exhaust themselves. They are not God. And yes, if a loved one's swelling in life because a tragedy took them and they're swelling, they do all they can to lower the swelling or to cover up a bruise, or you just don't know what they started with. When I mean they, I mean the professionals, the embalmers, right? Okay, so that also means the weight. Now, there are ways to find out the weight of a loved one, and there's a thing called a face sheet. When you go to a hospital or medical facility to receive a loved one, you have their biographical information, their dates of birth, their full legal name, their social security number. You need all that to file the death certificate. Oftentimes, it'll have their vitals or their height, their weight. And that would mean that a funeral professional, when they're making the arrangements, you have options as a professional, and you have in your little knowledge bank here. If the loved one's 500 pounds, you're not going to put them in a standard size casket. You're going to get them an extended size. That's what I call them. They're oversized casket, because they're actually reinforced for larger, heavier people. Again, I'm not sure how this happened, but I would assume it was a wood casket. I'm assuming they were a larger person and the casket bottom fell out. That's why you use a reputable casket company, like clicking the link in the description in my partnership with Titan Casket. You're able to literally select between 1,000 casket options, comfort of your home, online. Yes, you could prepay for your casket and save 50%. Yes, from what funeral homes would charge. And then at the time of yours or your loved one's death, that funeral home will receive your casket. Absolutely. You can prearrange it now, and they'll hold it. Titan will. You could live another 30 years, and they'll just hold on to it. It's real. It's true. Click the link in the description. That's great. Nonetheless, quality does matter. There was lawsuits to the casket company. The casket company had no history of selling this casket to the funeral home. I don't know where it ended up, but I do know the loved one fell out and ended up on the ground. That would be a nightmare. I don't even know what they would have done. The loved one's lying there on the floor. As a funeral professional, I guess they call the funeral home like, oh my God, send another casket, and then they rally beside them, and then they try to get them to repose and be positioned a certain way. I haven't a clue. But that, my friends, would be a nightmare. The next one is the dove release gone wrong. You've seen the video of it. I know you have. There's a moment where people will oftentimes release doves, white doves, and it symbolizes the soul entering into eternal life. And there's a lot of biblical referencing to the doves descending and ascending, and there's something beautiful about it. I think it's really nice. Did you know that a lot of these companies that do dove releases, they train their doves to fly to the house, back to the house in which the owner lives and they live, because probably really expensive. And so you train these doves, they fly back, and you know, it's just a nice thing. They probably end up loving on them and making them part of the family. Nonetheless, this particular family have a dove release moment, and the minister's talking, and then they go to release the dove. This dove is just a flying, and next thing you know, you see, that dove is gone. That dove is gone. Could you imagine you're at grandmom's grave, you're ready to lower the casket, and then look at this beautiful spiritual moment, and then, no. I won't have a dove release. I will have bagpipes. There's something beautiful about bagpipes at a funeral. Really, whenever the bagpipes are just echoing, it's really nice. Except if it's cold months, then you have the bagpipes themselves, and the pipes, they can't stay on key all the time because of the cold it affects. And it takes all kinds. The next one on the list, drinking on the job. Big no-no. When you're on call, you can't be drinking or participating in, if marijuana, for instance, is legal in your state, smoking a pot, you can't be impaired. Obviously, that's a no-brainer. What about the cemetery care staff? Yeah, the grave diggers. I call them the unsung heroes oftentimes, but in this instance, not the case. In 2017, a 33-year-old, all these stories involve young people. Let me go back, though, because you've pulled into a cemetery, I would assume, and have experienced grief or been connected to a degree of a loved one that has been buried at a cemetery. And maybe or maybe not, you've seen the cemetery crew. They're the ones that are hiding behind a shrub or hiding behind a mausoleum, or their equipment is somewhere very subtle. But if you're in like a country cemetery, it's just right dab in the middle. There's nowhere to go. Those individuals are always available 24 hours a day. Genuinely, they don't have a rotation. They genuinely have devoted their lives to caring for, tending to your loved one. At a moment's notice, they'll drop everything. They'll be on vacation. Doesn't matter. They'll come back. They will make sure that that grave is tended to, that loved one is tended to, the vault is set, and everything is as good as it possibly can be in that moment. Overall. And then in 2017, this 33-year-old loved one goes to be buried, and the family leaves, which for a while, when I first started, about first 5 years probably, they wouldn't lower the casket in front of the family. Like, that was such a beautiful symbol to a degree. It's almost like this final thing, right? People would leave the cemetery, and as you pulled off, you look over and you see your loved one just on the lowering device, like up above, which I always thought was odd. So what we would do is we would make sure we stayed with that loved one. As a funeral professional, Kentucky law requires that a loved one be stayed with until the burial is fully completed. So the last little bit, though, the last few years, we would start to lower the casket. That's what I was getting at. But in this instance, the family drove off. The casket had not been lowered. The cemetery care team, they hadn't started because they were drinking. This individual was just a drinking. Like, nothing. Like, drinking. The family come back later, and they hadn't finished even digging the hole. And they had empty beer bottles everywhere. So the family, irate, they even got the local news crew there. They get the grave digger and guy and everybody out of the way. They finish digging the job. They lower her casket. They do everything. They close her grave herself. I don't know. Maybe that guy was having a really bad day. I don't know. No excuse. Absolutely. I'm trying to make light of the fact that that's a terrible, terrible thing to have had happen. Absolutely. Because that's the place and space. People always talk about, like, monuments are dumb and everybody's just out for money in the funeral profession. It's not true. Things cost money. The reason why there are so many value offerings is because you all, generally speaking, asked for them. You want a nicer vault? Okay. You want a nicer casket? Okay. Everything costs money. But a monument is marking the place and space that recognizes someone you love more than anything, and you acknowledge that they exist, that they matter, that people love them. And so 100 years from now, when people are walking by that monument, they can look and they can say the name of your loved one. and forever they're remembered. It's a beautiful thing, really. But in this instance, that was not beautifully carried out. But the family, they let them have it. I don't know what happened to the guy. Hopefully more than a slap on the wrist. If you like this so far, be sure to subscribe. Click the bell to be notified when I release content. We're going to keep going. I don't know what number we're on, though. Oh, we're on number 8. This is called, we're going to call this one Runaway Casket. So in very rural areas in China, what they do is they will, just picture like farm areas. What they want to do is they want to find an area to bury a loved one that has what's called, you've heard of feng shui. It's very important, like scenery, environment, things such as that, because like the cemetery that many families select, it's not only because they have family buried there, but it's pretty. It has nice grounds. I mean, there's something to be said about that. But this particular space was on a mountainside. And the family, they had a pulley system to pull the loved one's casket. They called it a coffin up the mountainside. Well, the casket tumbled down the mountainside. Yeah, could you imagine? Again, this is like worse than the falling out part. This is the tumbling. The outcome, I'm not sure of. I would assume that they got another casket. The loved one ended up, but the pulley itself broke, malfunctioned. It was not the funeral or anybody else's fault. The system malfunctioned. Yeah, that's a horrible mishap. Let's just keep going about the graves. I mean, this is 3 in a row. So the next one is, there are many a times where grief takes over and it's so heavy. In the chapel, for instance, where a loved one will literally attempt to leap in the casket, to fall on top of a loved one, to hold them so tightly because they don't want to let them go. There have been times where myself and a colleague have literally laid our bodies over top of the closed end, the foot end of a casket, as it's rocking back and forth to prevent it from tipping over with the loved one, because these family members, they don't know how a loved one's casket's sitting there. They want so badly to just connect and touch and be with. It's really sad even whenever you have animals that prop their little paws up because they know what's going on. They do. But also at the cemetery, you gotta be careful around the freshly dug grave because they could cave. But in this instance, this is where a family, it is known where people will leap into graves sometimes. But in this instance in Kenya, there weren't 1, there weren't 2, there were 3 family members that jump in the grave. And it's not because of what you would think. It was the wife jumping in initially, and then 2 other people jump in because the husband was murdered. His body was found on the land right next to the individual who they think murdered him. And guess who? It was another one who was in the grave with her. She wanted the body to take the body to get investigated because the body was not autopsied. He didn't. He was like, we need to bury. And then another individual jumped in. It became quite the ordeal and screaming matches and all of that. Yeah, the body of the loved one didn't even make it into the grave. And they ended up, if I'm not mistaken, getting that investigation. I don't know what the outcome of it was, but I do know that this did happen. And it is common that it has happened before. It's going to happen again. In this instance, the grief had every reason to exist there because she thought, and she might have been right, that her husband was murdered and she wanted to get to the bottom of it. But I don't understand why she had to, I don't know. Why didn't she think this through a little earlier and be like, hey, medical examiner, you need to do your job now. And last but certainly not least, this has happened. I heard this a couple of years ago with another little 5-year-old Hispanic girl. This is hard to watch, but there is visual proof. It's called Lazarus syndrome. Back in the 18th, 19th century, they used to have what's called safety coffins. They were patented, really. They were coffins or caskets that were equipped with a rope, oftentimes a string that was attached to a bell. Some of them were even equipped with tubes that went above the ground. So if a loved one actually was not, in fact, dead or came back to life, they'd be able to breathe. They'd be able to notify people to dig them up. Some even had a window. Yeah, I know. But Lazarus syndrome is common. It is where you are medically pronounced dead. You are dead. You do not breathe. You are gone. But you come back. This little girl, 3-year-old girl in the Philippines, had a high fever, and died from a fever. At her family's visitation, this loved one obviously was not embalmed, because if she were embalmed, she would not have done this, because the formaldehyde, the chemicals, would have prevented this. Trust me. She wakes up in her casket. Her father, they watch her nostril move. There is video proof of this. The father lifts her out of the casket, holds her tightly. The family are going wild. I would too. And they take her home. Now, she was still very sick. She maintained a fever, and she actually ultimately did die. And the grief surrounding all of this, I can't imagine. It would be unfathomable. This 3-year-old girl dies. Family grieve. The family have private visitation for her, where they're at this church building. She comes back to life. And then she dies again. And she's really dead. And then there's this hope I would absolutely assume would be there. And she doesn't come back that next time. But the grief around all that. And the 5-year-old little girl that they said a few years ago came back to life. And then the 71-year-old, this usually happens in a morgue where someone will be pronounced dead at a hospital. They'll be transferred to the morgue, and then they come back to life. It actually is not uncommon. It's not happens all the time, but it's not uncommon. It's happened. This would be a sight to see. It's hard to watch the video. I can't watch the entire video. As someone who has kids of my own, let me know in the comments your thoughts on the 10 we just went over. Which one actually would keep you up at night? I would have to say one of the falling outs. Absolutely. One of the falling outs. Be sure to subscribe, click the bell to be notified. Thanks for being here, and we'll see you at the next one. Wow, 10 horrible things indeed.